Our speaker today is Ronald L. Banks, who will be joining us via Zoom. He is known as the Minimalist Poet. He's a speaker, writer, and coach based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Being a traditional guy who broke free from traditional thinking, Ronald's philosophy is about more than minimalism. It's about thinking differently and regaining control of your life. He's helped thousands of people enjoy the luxury of life through living with less. His mission is to help 1 million people make a radical life change by making simple shifts in their thinking. His work and unique style of presenting uses creative language, bold expressions, and messages of optimism. You can find his most recent work on YouTube, his podcast, and at www.ronaldlbanks.com. So now I will hand off to Ronald.
Wow. Well, thank you for that warm and inviting introduction. You know, sometimes I forget that I'm not just a creator on YouTube and that my message is really spreading much further than what I anticipated or what I'm realizing or have access to. So I'm still a little bit shocked by that. And when you guys reached out to me and asked me to speak here on this Sunday, I was a little thrown back, to be honest. I was kind of like, whoa, me, me, little old Ron, the YouTuber. But like I said, sometimes I forget that my message and what I'm trying to do here is spreading much further than just the walls of YouTube. So I will say thank you for that. I want to thank everyone who is behind the scenes and at the forefront of this ministry. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm both grateful and honored to be here and to share something that I'm passionate about, which is minimalism, owning less, intentional living, purposeful living, and then mixing in that idea of poetry as well. So the title of my talk today is The Poetic Alternative to Consumer Culture. Now, why the poetic alternative and not just the alternative, right? Well, as I was preparing this message and running through some notes and trying to figure out which direction I wanted to carry this conversation in, there are really two ideas for why I consciously chose the word poetic. Reason number one is because I myself am a poet. I've been a poet for about 8 or 9 years now. I've spoken at various open mics. I've hosted a few open mics of my own in the past. I've actually performed at a church as well here in my local area, some poetry they asked me to do. And I've also written and published 2 poetry books. But outside of that, at the core of this, I'm just a huge fan of the art form. I love the style of communicating, and you may pick up on that here on my talk today, and obviously through my YouTube videos as well. But the second reason why I consciously chose the word poetic is because it creates a bit of intrigue. The poetic alternative to consumer culture, right? It makes you wonder. Now, my goal for this talk is to provide answers to your wondering, as well as answer the indirect question that this statement is asking. What is the alternative to consumer culture? If you wouldn't mind indulging me for a moment, I'd like to quickly share a piece of my personal story. In my late teenage years and early 20s, I had the same viewpoint on life that I'd argue many other people also have. And that is that consumerism equals ultimate fulfillment. At the height of my most cluttered years, or what I like to call the acquisition phase of my life, right? I had what in hindsight was way too much. But at that time in my mind, it wasn't enough, right? Because I was chasing fulfillment. So the more I bought, the less I actually had. And so the cycle of overconsumption began, which increased my singular contribution to the many environmental effects that our consumer culture has as a society. Now, around that time, I had about 60 pairs of pants. Like, I kid you not. Many of them with tags still on them, so they were brand new, never worn. I had about 100 or so t-shirts, not including button downs and sweaters and jackets and all of the other traditional garments we buy. I had shoes I bought, but didn't necessarily need. And as a result, I never wore them. I kid you not. In the box and everything, tag and stickers still on them, never wore them. But that was just the clutter in my bedroom closet. I was also cluttered mentally and emotionally, which impacted the nature of my relationships. By the time I turned 23, my complete identity was lost in the shadows of my clutter and within the habits that consumer culture promotes. But that was a choice I made, right? It was a choice that I made. I volunteered to participate in a never-ending game that is overconsumption. Now, consumerism isn't inherently bad. That's not the message I'm promoting. That's not the message I want you to walk away from this conversation with. It would be very unrealistic to advise anyone to never buy anything. It's not how life works. But consumerism can be harmful to our planet, our society, and even our communities if we're not being mindful. So there's a choice we have to make. And similar to my choice that I made years ago to participate in the never-ending game that is overconsumption, we have two options available to us here today. And option number one is to continue doing what we're doing, which in most cases is overconsuming, buying things we don't need to impress people we don't know with money we don't have. Or option number two is to choose voluntary simplicity. Now, what is voluntary simplicity? Well, it's a post-consumerist strategy that rejects the materialistic lifestyle and effects of consumer culture in favor of what many people are already familiar with, simple living. But contrary to popular belief, simple living or voluntary simplicity, which again is a choice we get to make, it's not the glorification of living in poverty, right? It doesn't mean we have to live in emptiness or live in a space that is completely sterile. It doesn't mean we should completely dilute our life down to the bare minimum. And it doesn't mean we should dismiss technology and all of the other modern advancements we have available to us today. What it does mean is that voluntary simplicity is the importance or the understanding and obtaining of material sufficiency. So in other words, it goes against what modern culture generally assumes is true, that more is better. But I'm here to argue that more is not better, that more does not equal happiness, and that more or consumerism does not equal ultimate fulfillment. So what is the alternative to consumer culture? Well, to be clear, the alternative is voluntary simplicity, a choice we get to make. But why should we simplify? Why is that important? And where should we focus our attention first? I have a visual exercise. I'm a very visual person. So I have a visual exercise that I'd like you to participate in, if you wouldn't mind. I want you to imagine yourself holding a box, right? And in that box is all the clutter and stuff in your life. Physical clutter, of course, but maybe there's also a bit of regrets and anger mixed in there as well. Guilt from past decisions or mistakes you've made. And maybe there's a bit of financial stress sprinkled on top, right? Any and everything that is clutter related or could be adding weight to your life is in this box, right? Imagine yourself holding that. Now, imagine yourself while you're holding this box, trying to add more to your life. Maybe it's more values or more enjoyment, things you like to do outside of work. Maybe it's more stuff, right? Anything that may be inching you closer to true life fulfillment, you're adding it to that box. Now, the weight of that box is already heavy as it is. But as you add more, the weight is just getting heavier and heavier, right? See, the issue with this is that we can't really add more to our life if we're still holding on to things that we don't need to be holding on to and that aren't serving our life or our life's vision in the best way possible. So an easy yet not so easy fix for this is just to let it go, right? Drop the box or to choose voluntary simplicity. Now, there are 4 key areas that I believe we should focus our attention first when it comes to simplifying. And that is personal, social, environmental, and spiritual, which includes our mental and emotional space. Now, what makes this poetic, in my opinion, is that these 4 key areas that we are choosing to focus our attention when it comes to simplifying are the exact same 4 areas that will help us create a more fulfilled life on the other side. Let's talk about it. The first one is personal. So many people are drawn to the idea of simplicity because they want to escape the rat race and live more with less. As I think back over my story growing up, my late teenage years and early 20s, when I got my first corporate job, I went to college, I graduated in 2015. I got my first corporate job and I said, hey, you know what, I'm excited. This is what I'm supposed to do. You know, I'm finally making adult money. And the job I had at the time required me to travel quite often. I was traveling maybe twice a week on average across the United States. And that was my first time outside of family events actually traveling to that extent. And I was really taken back by that experience by looking at it and saying, hey, you know, there's so much more to life than going to work and working. I'm experiencing so many places I've never seen, places I've heard of, events that I've never really seen or been a part of before. And now I'm actually behind the scenes and managing these events. For example, NASCAR and IndyCar. I was on the marketing team for the company that I worked for. And we sponsored NASCAR and IndyCar, and I'm in the pits, talking to the drivers and experiencing that side of life that I didn't grow up getting to experience. So when I say that we want to escape the rat race and live more with less, I like to look at that as experiencing a fuller life with less clutter and more clarity. Now, consumer culture distracts us from what is best in our lives, or from reaching our full potential in many cases, or from experiencing true fulfillment. Now, with all of this, right, it can make us believe that we aren't good enough or that we don't have enough. So therefore, it functions as this way of keeping us locked in this work and spend cycle in life. We go to work, we make money, we spend it. We go to work, we make money, we spend it, right? But see, if we can rethink our relationship, think differently about our relationship with money and possessions, we may be able to free up more time and energy to pursue what truly inspires us, what actually makes us happy, right? And in this way, voluntary simplicity can actually enhance our meaning of life rather than be seen as something that is stripping us of the life we have now. So how do we actually practice this, right? How do we actually practice voluntary simplicity in our personal lives? Well, it starts by prioritizing decluttering, actively decluttering your life. I like to call this decluttering as you live, which is something my wife and I do regularly. We keep a trash bag by our front door, and every time we come across something, whether it's getting dressed or in our kitchen or in the closet, if we come across something that we don't need, it goes right into that bag. So as you're prioritizing decluttering in your life, and maybe you should start with your clothes, that's where I started and probably the easiest place to start. But as you start to declutter, you'll carry this practice with you through other areas of your life. And the more you practice it, the more benefits you'll receive. The second idea I have for you is social. Now, although there are indeed many personal incentives to adopting voluntary simplicity, such as more time and more energy, of course, there's also the importance of realizing that there is a social and humanitarian reason to adopt voluntary simplicity. For example, the nature of our relationships or the context in which we interact with other people in our community. Now, when we prioritize consumer culture, actually, we're making it known that we value stuff and things over the relationships and personal connections that we have in our life. However, simple living, I believe, has the power to foster a heightened sense of human connection and community. It puts relationships and people ahead of stuff and things. It puts giving and sharing ahead of selfishness and greed. And that in itself can make us live a more fulfilled life. Two friends of mine who you probably heard of, Joshua Phillips Milburn and Ryan Nicodemus, who together formed The Minimalist. I had the honor of joining them in LA in their podcast studio, I want to say 2 years ago now, to talk with them on their podcast. Josh and I specifically text every now and then and have conversations on the phone, but they have a saying that they go by, and that is to love people and use things because the opposite never works, which is a very, very, very powerful message that is synonymous, in my opinion, with this idea of voluntary simplicity, especially in the discussion of the importance around our social life and how we value people and relationships in comparison to stuff and things. The third idea I have for you is environmental. Now, this is a less talked about reason for adopting voluntary simplicity. Most times when you're talking about simple living or decluttering or minimalism or living with less, most people only look at that from the physical space within our four walls of our home, the clothes we own, the knickknacks we decorate with, whether or not we have pictures on our wall. That's normally what we think about. But there's also an environmental impact to our choice of living, right? Now, when it comes to increasing simple living, it has this form, it has this way of impacting the planet and our effect on other ecological disasters. So if we reduce our consumption, it creates this idea of sustainability for the future of not only ourselves, but also the planet. Now, I can say from personal experience that simple living is a very promising, if not the most promising way to personally confront many of the environmental impacts that we see today. Climate change, pollution, and the overconsumption of non-reusable resources. Now, being that I shared part of my story at the beginning of this conversation, I said that my consumption habits years ago added to many of these ecological disasters that we see. I mean, I was buying stuff like crazy and throwing it away, buying stuff like crazy and throwing it away. However, today, even though my singular contribution isn't much in the grand scheme of things, I'm one person, it is having a major impact on the overall health of our planet and my life. So how can we practice this? How can we practice simple living, conscious living, minimalism, owning less, voluntary simplicity from an environmental standpoint? Well, it requires us to first limit the amount of waste we produce and add to our landfills. That's first and foremost. The second thing is that it requires us to make more conscious purchase decisions. Now, this may require you to adjust your habits and change the way you view money and how you manage your money, or how you view things and purchasing things. It may also require you to start purchasing from companies that prioritize sustainability practices themselves, which is something my wife and I do. Many of the clothing companies we purchase from now are sustainable clothing companies. We've actually started grocery shopping at a few zero waste stores as well, which is a bit of an adjustment. When you grow up going to traditional grocery stores, it is a bit of an adjustment, but I will say that I'm not perfect. My wife is not perfect. I'm not asking you to be perfect, and we can't expect ourselves to be perfect. That's just way too much pressure to put on ourselves. But as long as we're contributing to this world, we should do our best to make a positive imprint. I truly believe that. Now, the fourth and final thought that I want to share with you is spiritual, which includes the mental and emotional side of life. Again, this is something that we don't normally think about. When you think of owning less and simplicity and minimalism, it's usually just the physical space. Like I said, the clothes we own, the knickknacks we decorate with, or whether or not we have pictures on our wall. Now, at no fault of our own, the non-material side of life is often neglected when one aims to simplify, right? But why is this? Now, I truly believe that this is the reason, because I truly believe that we neglect the non-material side of life because we can't see that clutter the same way we can the physical side of life. So we can see that we have too many clothes. We can see that we have knickknacks on our bookcase that we don't necessarily need. We can see whether or not this wall is cluttered with photos that aren't really serving us. We can see those things, but we can't really see what is cluttering us on the non-material side of life. But see, by shifting our attention from the material side of life to the non-material side of life, with the help of voluntary simplicity, it can help us facilitate a deeper awareness, right? That is needed for true fulfillment. Now, this level of awareness is not something that can easily be explained through words. Maybe if I took a day or two to draft a poem, I'm sure I could come up with a metaphor or two to deeper explain this further. But personally, I've always found that experience will outweigh explanation hand over hand every time. Experience will outweigh explanation hand over hand every time. So in practice, I strongly want us to consider to spend some time isolating ourselves away from consumer culture long enough to unlearn it, right? So this includes maybe isolating ourselves from other influences that have the potential to sway us back into consumerist habits. Maybe those are relationships or friendships that we have that are constantly pressuring us to buy things we don't need because they're buying it. Or maybe we feel pressured to buy it because someone else has it and we feel like if we don't get it, we're not keeping up. This also requires us to look internally. What's going on inside of us? Is there a spiritual battle we're fighting? Is there a void we're trying to fill with stuff and things? See, when we fully embrace this idea of simple living or voluntary simplicity, we are also appreciating the possibilities of this alternative mode of being, right? Which then allows us to enhance our life in so many other ways. And then we quickly realize that a simple life is a truly beautiful and profoundly beautiful life, one that is exciting to experience and worth living. So as I prepare to close or land this plane, there is a final thought that I want to leave you with. And that is that simplicity is a choice. And as I'm encouraging you, suggesting that a simple life is a viable alternative to consumer culture that will not only improve our lives and the lives of others, but also help us minimize our impact on the planet. At the very base level, at a very, very basic level, simplicity is the authentic celebration of life. I'm gonna say that again. Simplicity is the authentic celebration of life. And through simple living, we can focus more on what matters, experience more, and create a better life, a more fulfilled life that is truly full. Thank you.